Welcome back to Lifting the Fog, the scientific method applied to the World Trade Center. I'm a member of the steering committee. My name's Mickey Huff. I teach courses on 9/11 media and propaganda at several area colleges. I'm sort of emceeing here between sessions. We just heard from Dr. Stephen Jones. If you missed Dr. Jones, he'll be speaking again this evening in conversation with several other panelists. And if you need a schedule, the schedules are right out here out this door. There's also a donation box if you feel generous. If you've already donated, we thank you quite graciously, and we appreciate your support. And most of all, it's just great that we're all here together to talk about these really important issues, specifically things like science and facts. Let's hear it for facts and reasoned arguments. So what I'm going to do right now is introduce the next session. We are running a little behind, and we thank you for your patience. The evening session still will be starting around 6:30, but remember, I would like to at least announce that in the evening session we're going to be showing a little bit of about, what is it, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of a David Ray Griffin piece. So that'll probably start around 6:30. So the panel discussion and speakers will probably start closer to near the 7 o'clock hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and so on. And Dr. Jones will be back to have questions this evening. He'll also is invited by Jim Hoffman to have more questions at the end of Jim Hoffman's session. And so right now I'm going to introduce to you a really key activist and member of the 9/11 community, and one of the very few voices at the local community radio station KPFA who has bravely spoken out quite a bit on 9/11, and in fact was the first person to interview Jim Hoffman on scientific issues and physical evidence concerning the 9/11 towers collapse, WTC-7, the NIST cover-up, and so on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Bonnie Faulkner.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Yara Mako and I produce Guns and Butter every Wednesday at 1 p.m. here in Berkeley on KPFA. And it's quite, this seems so normal to us now to be coming to a conference on scientific evidence, physical evidence. It was years before anybody would really go public. People who did research, people who spoke out publicly on 9/11 did not shun physical evidence as if that was the weakest evidence. And here we are in the end of 2006, and it's turning out to be some of the strongest evidence. I first saw a presentation by research scientist Jim Hoffman. It was in Oakland, California, and it was on September 11th, 2003, and he was giving a PowerPoint presentation at the Little Humanist Hall, some of which I saw, and it was really struck me at how dramatic it was and how all of a sudden it was so obvious that the physical evidence was so very important. Jim Hoffman got together with me at KPFA, and we did a long 2-3 hour interview, which Yarrow and I then edited down into 2 full shows. And those shows were called Your Eyes Don't Lie, Common Sense, Physics, and the World Trade Center Collapses. And we aired those shows in early January of 2004. And they created a bit of a sensation here. They were very popular. They were groundbreaking shows. And in that show, Jim Hoffman, and also in his presentation, spoke about his first paper that he wrote, his scientific paper, The North Tower Dust Cloud, Analysis of Energy Requirements for the Expansion of the Dust Cloud Following the Collapse of One World Trade Center. And he also deconstructed the FEMA report in that show. And then we followed up in September 2005 with another great show on another paper he wrote, Building a Better Mirage, NIST's 3-year, $20 million cover-up of the crime of the century. A pioneer researcher into the physical evidence of September 11th, 2001, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jim Hoffman.
giving a somewhat different talk than covering a lot of the same subject, but from a different perspective and with kind of a more of a top-down global view than Stephen Jones, who's focused very much on more the microscopic view of the forensic investigation of the residues. Oh, it's the computer? Okay, well, we don't need the computer audio for the most part until we get to a segment that I would like to include from Kevin Ryan, who you might have heard of. Now, I wanted to run about a 20-minute segment from him that will cover a part of this, the subject that I want to talk. So I want to talk basically about three things: a review of what are the official theories of the collapse of the Twin Towers, as well as what are the popular notions that undergirded them. Two, how are these unprecedented events investigated? What was the nature of those investigations? And how do the official collapse theories comport with the actual observations of the physical evidence of these events, in particular the NIST theory, which is now the current theory of favor. Just to review, I'm going to first talk about the popular collapse notions and the fact that these events were cast in the public mind as collapses from the very beginning. Now, a collapse frames these events in a very different way from, if the word explosion or destruction is used. It already presupposes that these buildings fell in on themselves rather than were destroyed by an external force. In fact, the very nature of these events were being history was basically being rewritten the day after the collapse, with the New York Times conflating the crashes of the aircraft with the destruction of these buildings, which occurred 56 and 102 minutes later, as if they were the same events, writing, "Hijackers rammed jetliners into each of New York's World Trade Center towers yesterday, toppling both in a hellish storm of ash, glass, smoke, and leaping victims, as if the planes crashed in and the buildings toppled at the same time." So again, I'm going to be covering these three topics, but in particular with regard to the scientific method. How scientific are the official collapse theories? How scientific were the official investigations? And using the scientific method, comparing the collapse theories with physical observations about the events of that day and evaluating them. So the scientific method, Stephen Jones has already talked at some length about that. It's basically this process of formulating hypotheses, comparing them to making predictions, comparing those predictions to observations, and then repeating this process, refining the hypothesis on the basis of those observations to keep coming up with a theory that describes the world in a more and more accurate way. Conversely, there's pathological science is kind of the opposite of that process, where you falsify data, where you ignore data, where you start with presupposed conclusions and then try to tweak the data to fit those conclusions. And what I'll be showing is that in particular with regard to NIST investigation, that it has many characteristics of pathological science, not the actual scientific method. So first, I just wanted to go through a review of some of the popular collapse notions. These weren't ideas that were actually, or things that were explicitly articulated by the official funded investigations, but were rather notions that sprang out of the box and were used as in kind of the mode of propaganda. And in a way, they actually undergird the official explanation. And they are kind of are a form of stopthink to sort of create these ideas that prevent people from actually looking objectively at these events. So, and I'm going to be talking about how there's various levels of the official theories. Now, there's specific theories that talk about specific collapse mechanisms. There's a variety of those. But on the other hand, there's a very general form of the official story, which is basically that the total collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers was entirely the result of the structural damage and subsequent fires from the plane crashes, and that there were not additional causes. It was not the result of explosives planted in the building. And so there's this hard divide between this official explanation, whatever particulars are used to support it, on the one hand, and the alternative explanation, which basically is controlled demolition. Not necessarily controlled demolition that's done in the way that we're familiar with, but a controlled engineered event nonetheless. So there's this hard divide, and it's hard to deny that the entirety of 9/11 was an inside job if you reject the official story. So I'm going to be attacking or showing the flaws in the official story and eventually in the most general form of it. And the alternative to that is some version of it being a planned event, a planned demolition event, and therefore implying that the entire operation of 9/11 was an inside job, with all that that implies for the whole political landscape today. So starting with these popular collapse notions, we've all heard, this idea of the towering inferno. It's used by, and these notions appear in these, these very, respectable publications, Scientific American and so forth, and yet they're not based on science. They don't correspond very well with observed events, like were the fires in the towers were they really towering infernos? Well, certainly not as much as other high-rise fires that we've seen. What I call the core meltdown or killer fires theory, articulated by so-called structural engineers, using these anthropomorphic terms like, I'll get to that, but anyway, making these just bold assertions that the fires melted the steel, which is, of course, just ludicrous. But yet you have all these experts affiliated with universities and structural engineers and so forth, making these claims on the day of the attack that the fires melted the steel, ignoring, the disparity of hundreds of degrees Celsius between the temperatures that you could reasonably achieve with burning hydrocarbon fires and the temperatures needed to melt steel. Despite the origin of this ludicrous idea of the steel melting fires, people that have questioned the official story have been lambasted with it as if it were using it as a straw man attack. 9/11 research has never misrepresented the official story as being a fire melt steel story, and yet publications like Scientific American have attacked 9/11 research as misrepresenting the issue. So it's a very effective straw man attack on their part to misrepresent what the issue is. Another aspect of these popular collapse notions is the frequent application of anthropomorphism to make people think that these buildings were like humans, like that they were sick and that they died. Structural engineer Chris Weiss saying that the fires killed the buildings. There's this book that's a very valuable source of historical information about the towers, but the subtext of this book is that that these towers were just waiting to crumble. They talked about, they would have crumbled in a heartbeat. The defense systems of the towers, as if their immune systems were failing or their vital signs were failing. Talking like a fatal malady to spreading to other parts of the building. And these kind of references occur throughout the official reports as well. Even if they don't say it explicitly, you're made to think in these terms of like column failure being this kind of contagion that spreads around the building. And so with that, then, let's talk about the actual official theories. These are the theories that were actually articulated in official reports, whether they be government reports or reports for insurance claim purposes. And basically, I describe them as being three. The wet noodle theory, which is just that the column suddenly failed. It doesn't get into any failures with the floor. It actually absolves the floors of any role in this. The floor pancake theory, in which the floors supposedly pancake down inside the building, and then that causes the columns to fail indirectly. And then what I call the kitchen sink theory, which is the current theory endorsed by by far the most extensive investigation of National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And that's the one I'll be focusing on. So the purpose of this review here is not to critique these other theories, but just to lay out what the history of these theories are. For the purpose of the critique of those earlier theories, I'd refer to my talk, The World Trade Center Demolition, which goes into the flaws in some detail. So the wet noodle theory is again, this idea that the columns just suddenly failed, and due to being elevated to some really high temperature. There was an article that was published in a scientific journal just 2 days after the attack that had it all figured out. They were just confidently proclaimed that the resistance of the building was easily overcome when the columns were heated to 800 degrees Celsius. That's a very high temperature, and there's no evidence for that. And the column failure theory was also endorsed by the Silverstein insurance claim investigation, which Kevin Ryan will be talking a little bit about. That theory is completely contrary to the next theory, the one that most people learned through television specials such as Nova Discovery Channel, where they talked about this pancaking idea, that the connections of the floors to the columns failed, the floors pancaked down, and then the columns just fell apart. And so that is based on this notion that you have these lightweight floor trusses that span this distance between the very strong core of these buildings and the perimeter columns, which are the two vertical support elements of these buildings. And so the idea is that once the floors pancake, they leave tall, freestanding, unsupported columns. And the idea is kind of that the floors hold up the columns. So if the columns lack lateral support, they will start to buckle. Even though that theory is completely belied by the photographs and videos of these events, which don't show any evidence of any large-scale buckling. What they do show is the buildings just being consumed from top to bottom in incredibly explosive events. The FEMA authors, notably, aren't even very confident, don't appear to be very confident about this theory because they don't even commit to the central core columns being freestanding, which they, of course, aren't. It's a very densely cross-braced lattice of steel work, very robust cores of these buildings, which are often written out of these buildings entirely by the popular descriptions of them. So this pancake theory blames the connections of the floor trusses. We see the top chord here, the bottom chord here of the floor truss, which is this about 2-foot deep structure that runs, crisscrosses and runs under these floor pans, which there's concrete floors poured. And the idea is that these, what Professor Eager of MIT called the angle clips, failed, and they unzipped around the building, and then the floors pancaked inside the building, and that led to total building collapse. Now, what's interesting about this is that, so he's blaming these, quote, angle clips, which they're not actually. There were multiple bolts, there were welded connections, they were actually very strong. What's interesting about this theory is that it is completely contradicted by the theory that I'll be describing in more detail, the one by NIST, which blames the persistence of those connections on the building. And I'll be explaining, blames the persistence of these connections on the destruction of the building. So the fact that these didn't fail is one of the key steps in the total destruction of these buildings, according to NIST. And finally, this is the theory that I'll be spending some time describing in detail. I call it the kitchen sink theory because it has so many elements, and also because it's so large and unwieldy, very few people are likely to read it. Kevin Ryan calls it the tin rat theory. That is, they'll never read all this anyway theory. They produced they produced 10,000 pages of reports. I've only read the final report, which is 280 pages, and that's long enough. And as I'll be pointing out, it uses diversionary detail to basically sidestep the whole question that they're actually supposed to be investigating what really brought the buildings down. And also, this theory is the subject of my detailed review, which we might still have some copies of, called Building a Better Mirage, and that was the one that Bonnie Faulkner was referring to. That's also the basis of the radio interview that she did. And then, okay, so those are the officially articulated theories, just 3 of them, really. But then there's other theories that are implied by those theories, but those theories really don't go there, because the way these theories work is they have this initial collapse scenario, and that's supposed to get things falling down, get something happening, and then it kind of just transitions to hand waving. Then you're just supposed to imagine that the building just falls apart from there. So they focus on initiating events, but they become extremely vague the closer they get to the actual destruction of the buildings. But in general, they endorse a theory, or they imply the endorsement of a theory that has to do with the top of the building crushing the rest of the building progressively all the way down. And I'm going to be describing the way that's described as a pile driver theory, or a progressive collapse theory. So progressive collapse theory is this notion of there's a collapse event, it starts, and then it grows disproportionately. The one problem with this is that there's very few real-world examples of progressive collapse, almost no examples outside of the alleged cases of 9/11, of progressive total collapses of steel frame buildings. NIST casts it a little bit differently. It kind of shies away from this language of progressive collapse, and instead it uses this idea that global collapse ensued. So they actually truncate their investigation at the moment that, quote, global collapse ensued. And I mean, global collapse isn't even a term that you see often in engineering. I mean, you usually talk about total collapse, but they just by implication assert that once these certain conditions are met, that suddenly global collapse is inevitable. So they use it throughout their report. Global collapse, you know, uncontrolled fires result in burnout with global collapse. Or here's a place that articulates it a little bit better. Once the upper building section began to move downwards, the weakened structure in the impact and fire zone was not able to absorb the tremendous energy of the falling building section, and global collapse ensued. But global collapse or progressive collapse, another more descriptive way to think of it is the pile driver theory, which was articulated by this engineer Hamburger, who worked on some of the official reports. And so a number of these engineers and officials talked about this idea that it was a pile driver theory. A pile driver has a big heavy weight that comes down and smashes on a pile and drives it into the ground. So the idea is that the top of the building is acting as this smashing thing, just smashing the building all the way down. And however much that theory isn't specifically articulated in the official theories, it is nonetheless a necessary step in the progression to total collapse, and I'll be talking more about that. Although there is one other possibility, which is that there is this very vague idea of a shock wave theory, in which there's actually the shock wave that travels down through the building, maybe faster than the speed of gravitational freefall, and breaks up the building even before the falling mass encounters those structures. So this kind of gets around some of the arguments about how the things came down too fast, because the building is breaking up before the mass even encounters it. And I don't even want to dignify this theory by really addressing it, because I think I don't see any evidence for it. And clearly, if you look at the videos and all the evidence of these events, the buildings are being rapidly consumed from the top down. You don't see the destruction happening below the zone where this explosive action is. So now the next section, I'm going to be addressing the conduct of the official investigations. How scientific were they? How honest were they? Who was involved in them? What did they proceed? Did they honestly investigate these events, or did they start with predetermined conclusions? The first thing I'd like to look at is just the crime scene. I mean, you had a 16-acre crime scene that was just the site of a totally unprecedented events. Just total destruction of buildings for causes that were nowhere close to causes that have ever destroyed steel frame buildings before. Events that would have held the clues to these great engineering mysteries. And instead of being treated like the crime scene that they were, just about the opposite thing happened, where they sealed off the scene and they started carting off the steel and destroying it as quickly as possible, building new infrastructure to expedite the process, recycling it. Most of it was shipped to Asia, apparently, to be recycled. And it's not, there's very little documentation of what actually happened or what the condition of a lot of the steel was. Very, very little of it survived. This operation went on for about 6 months. And they brought in heavy equipment and just really removed it really rapidly, especially starting about beginning of November in 2001. After they kind of stopped, there was actually a conflict between the firefighters who were trying to recover body parts and stuff, and then Giuliani insisted that the pace be stepped up. So now I'm going to switch to about a 20-minute segment from Kevin Ryan, which I think is really good. And this is a segment from a 1-hour talk that he gave, and the talk is available on a DVD. The name of the talk is A New Standard for Deception. It's about NIST's report. So I want to pick it up right here, and this will go on for about 20 minutes. And I'll take over then and talk more about the conduct of the official investigations. But okay. Okay. Hopefully we won't have that same problem. That's on. I plugged it in the way, right? I think this is the plug I had, or maybe that's not the plug I had. Maybe it was. Oh, yeah. Is this so? How many? Yeah. Okay, let's try that.
Because these are unique events. There's a long string of unique that I've done and other people have done show that the steel temperatures in the impact zones could have reached a maximum of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So where are the real experts?
Okay, we're going to try something else here. Thank you. We're going to try going directly to the mic. That's not enough damage.
Terrorists don't come back to life after stealing our freedom. And tall buildings
It is
do
unplugged.
not collapse themselves.
Yeah.
There's certainly no expert to tell us why
It's all the way up.
But there is always an official expert for the terrorists.
Oh, there's one in there.
Talks about multiple explosions, eyewitness accounts of undetonated bombs in the buildings.
I think it's right
FBI
here.
confiscating the videos and not releasing them. And experts saying they could have.
Okay, I guess this is just not going to work. So I'll just continue on.
You got it? Okay, let me get the microphone for you. Just 1 second.
So, but anyway, I highly recommend this video because Kevin goes into great depth about okay.
Okay, let's put you back over here. Get the mic back. Here, you might mention that it's in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
video. Pull this up. So you guys say you're moving out of the light.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The light, we need light.
Okay. Let's see my computer too.
Okay, I think we got it. Oh, I thought we already moved.
The excerpt that I was going to play was from A New Standard for Deception. It was a 1-hour talk that Kevin Ryan gave, and the part that I was going to play discussed what some of the history of the investigations was and who was involved in the investigation. And he points out that it's the same cast of characters showing up over and over again. I mean, we hear, Popular Mechanics tries to make it sound like there's all these experts who endorse the official story, but if you actually look at the number of people who were involved in the investigations, it's a very small number of people who showed up in investigations that endorsed entirely different theories. For example, here he shows that the FEMA chapter, the various authors of the FEMA chapters went on to become some of the authors of the NIST report. And again, I emphasize that these were two basically contradictory theories. The NIST theory turns the FEMA theory on its head by saying that, oh, it was because the truss-to-column connections didn't fail that the buildings came down, not because they did fail and the floors pancaked. Ryan is also very knowledgeable about the design claims of the people who designed the towers. Now, you might have heard interviews with Leslie Robertson, who was involved in the architectural firm that designed the towers, but the lead architect was John Skilling, and there's a number of quotes that we know of from John Skilling that were made during the era that the towers were designed, and those included claims that they had indeed contemplated the crash of large jetliners into these buildings, jetliners that, by the way, were really roughly about the same size as the 767s that hit them. I mean, there's not that much difference between a 707-340 and a 767-200. and that they had in fact considered the fact that they would dump fuel into the buildings and that there would be fires, but that would not threaten the buildings. Also, you hear the claim, actually from Robertson himself, saying that, we had only contemplated low-flying, slow-flying planes, and that these impacts were much more rapid. But again, if you go back and look at some of the quotes from people involved in the design of the buildings at the time, like John Skilling. John Skilling is no longer alive to defend his buildings. He said that they had been investigated and found to be safe in an assumed collision with a large jetliner, a Boeing 707 or DC-8, traveling 600 miles an hour. So that's not much different from the speed of the planes that hit them. So then I want to go and look at the methods that NIST used in its investigation. And first I'm going to look at it, just kind of take you through some of the methods that it used. And this was all part of Ryan's segment that I wanted to play. And then I'm going to look at the techniques that they used in their reports, many of which appear designed to deceive the reader. They reviewed, they have a section of, they talk about reviewing documents, but somehow these important design documents that talked about the contemplation of jetliner crashes came up missing. They also failed to find the records of the steel being tested, even though we know apparently the steel was tested. So all these important documents came up missing. Ryan's, one of Ryan's bosses, I think his name was Koblik, actually went to UL and was very proudly announced that the UL had tested the steel and the steel did beautifully. And then after Ryan went public, Ryan is definitely a whistleblower because he was fired from his job for this communication to somebody involved in the NIST, Frank Gale involved in the NIST report becoming public. Once this came out, then all of a sudden NIST officials, the UL officials are denying that they had any role in certifying the steel used in the Twin Towers back in the 1960s. On the witness interviews, NIST wasn't able to get access to this large body of eyewitness evidence by first responders, New York City firefighters, and emergency responders, who this rich vein of evidence that was finally made public in the middle of 2005 that contained numerous examples of perceptions related to controlled demolition, either people saying that that they definitely thought that it looked just like a controlled demolition that you see on TV, or that they heard loud explosions at the onsets of the events, or they saw the building blowing out on all sides. Many of these same people say in the same excerpts that later we were told it was just the floors collapsing. But the important thing is that their perception at the time, and these are firefighters largely who are people very experienced in seeing buildings brought down, was that they were brought down by controlled demolition. There's numerous of these examples, and yet there's no evidence of any review of any of this of these actual testimonies in the NIST report. They completely ignore this large body of evidence. Their steel analysis completely ignored what Stephen Jones was talking about, that very interesting Appendix C in FEMA's report, which talked about this very peculiar sulfidation, sulfur corrosive attack of the steel that remained unexplained. The New York Times described as perhaps, quote, perhaps the greatest mystery of the investigation. And I guess that all got swept under the rug because it's not even mentioned by NIST, apparently nowhere in their reports. What they did do in their investigation of the steel is they took whatever samples they had. They did have a few samples from the fire zones, despite the very systematic destruction of this body of evidence. And the highest temperatures that they found they found few samples that even reached 250 degrees Celsius. And they even stated that there was no evidence that any of the samples reached temperatures above 600 degrees Celsius. And that's using paint deformation analysis. So let's look at some more of their laboratory tests. Now, they did these full floor mock-up tests where they take a fireproof floor assembly and they basically put a furnace under it, elevate the temperature to like 900 degrees Celsius for several hours, and then load up the floor with all this stuff. They actually have double the loads that would have been in normal conditions, and measure how much deformation they get. Because this is a common thing in large fires in steel frame buildings. You do see sagging, but we don't have any examples of actual collapses due to fires in high-rise steel frame buildings. And so they couldn't get the floors to collapse. So see, originally NIST was going with that floor pancake theory, but they couldn't get the failures to happen. So in midstream, they had to apparently change plans and come up with a whole new theory, because they mostly got just a few inches of sagging, and they didn't get any kind of collapse event. Just as an example of how incredibly, I just shook my head when I read this. This is actually in the report. Of the kinds of tweaking they did in their laboratory methods to apparently achieve the results that they wanted. One example of that is, this is an actual quote, a spray burner generating 1.9 to 3.4 megawatts of power was ignited in a 23-foot by 11.8 foot by 12.5 foot height compartment. The temperatures near the ceiling approach 900 degrees Celsius. Now, I don't know if people are that familiar with what a megawatt versus a kilowatt is, but a kilowatt output is maybe what a wood stove, maybe a couple of kilowatts is what a wood stove would generate, maybe 5 kilowatts. We're talking about 2 megawatts. That's 500 wood stoves in the space of a living room. I mean, those are their experimental methods. They also talk about hyperventilating spaces to, give them much more oxygen so that it will burn much hotter. So they just do all this. They just blatantly do this kind of manipulation of their test to get the kind of results they want, because I guess they needed 900 degrees Celsius ceiling temperatures, and that's what it took. And that's not science. That's the opposite of science, where you start from conclusions and then you manipulate your models until you get the results you want. But even worse, it gets even worse when you get into the computer simulations, because they had a bunch of computer simulations, but most of them about the fires, and they created these scenarios, and it's not clear what relationship those had to reality. But even if you look at those scenarios, they don't support assertions that they make elsewhere, like 900 degree temperatures in the core, when even their own computer simulations don't show relatively cool temperatures in the core, where there was a very little flammable material and very large steel columns that would tend to wick away the heat. So now I want to review NIST report with a view to its apparent design to deceive the reader into overlooking their manipulations and the unscientific nature of their report, and just basically the way that they try to support their conclusion with a lot of apparently dishonest techniques. I like this quote where they say, in our cities there has never been an experience of a disaster of such magnitude, nor have there been any in which the total collapse of a high-rise building occurred so rapidly and with little warning. Well, there are examples of very rapid destruction of buildings, but usually the people are removed from the building. They don't even disclose that there's not a single example of, nowhere in their report do they disclose that there's not a single example of a skyscraper in North America that has ever collapsed for any reason, nor that there's not a single example of a steel frame high-rise building anywhere in the world that's ever collapsed due to fires, or even a combination of structural damage and fires. The only examples involve severe earthquakes or demolition. Another technique they use in their report is this kind of diversionary detail, where they go into great detail. I'm going to show you that stack of papers that was this thick. Look at the detail that they use to model their airplanes. They have all the seats modeled. They have all the turbine blades modeled. Every single turbine blade in the plane is modeled. And they crash their imaginary their model plane in the model buildings. And they get results that I think are really, really realistic. I believe that that's a pretty good simulation. It does match the actual damage pattern pretty well, if that's what that was actually produced by their model. But the question is, how does and this is it does have some relevance to the collapse theory. But you don't see anything like this detail as you get closer to the actual event that they were tasked with explaining. How did the buildings come down, and why did it look like a controlled demolition? They also do things like create these damage scenarios that look completely wrong to me, because if you actually plot the trajectory of Flight 175 through the tower, the fuselage almost completely misses the core, and yet they have all this very extensive core damage. I mean, these are massive columns in the core here. And how do they justify just, these columns are like obliterated supposedly? There were people who actually walked down from above the crash zone through the crash zone in the core. I mean, the fires weren't even that bad that they were actually able to egress through that part of the building. And here's another example, looking at the way that they describe the extent of the fires. Now, they give two scenarios, two snapshots in time for the fires in the North Tower. One at 9:02 a.m. and one at 9:38 a.m. And notice that the fires are much more extensive in the second snapshot, which I don't actually doubt. I think that maybe these are actually accurate observations, and you have more combustibles burning. The official story, of course, is that it's not the jet fuel so much. The jet fuel ignited other combustibles, and then you had this spread of fires over large areas on the floors. What's very interesting is if you look at the South Tower, there's only one snapshot. Why? I think it's because they're trying to hide the fact that the fires in the south tower were diminishing over time. And that's very problematic for the official story. I mean, if the damage has already happened, the fires are becoming less intense, the steel would be cooling down. How do you get a collapse to happen if the fire is getting less intense? Nor do they mention the fact that Chief Oriole Palmer and other firefighters had reached the 78th floor sky lobby. They were up in this area here, or somewhere around there, and they were reporting a plan to put out the fires. So they hide all these very essential facts that are problematic to the official story. And they make it sound like, oh, any attempt to fight the fire would have been fruitless. Well, these guys had a plan to fight the fire. He was calling for 2 lines to knock down 2 pockets of fire. Now here's what I think is a really interesting example of using deception to mask a deeper deception. And this is my own theory about it. Okay, so they disclosed that they do multiple scenarios. So they have this computer model, and they have this multi-floor model, and they crash their virtual plane in, and they supposedly heat up the columns of this computer model. But they have case A and B to describe the North Tower, and C and D. Now, A and C are supposedly based on the realistic parameter, realistic values, and B and D make everything more favorable to a collapse. Bigger, faster plane, faster impact speed, decrease in the tower strength, increase in aircraft strength. All fairly minor adjustments, but all working together would supposedly make for a better a scenario more favorable to total collapse or some kind of collapse of the building. But what I think they're doing is that they're actually disclosing these tweaked models to induce you to overlook the fact that their models don't predict any kind of collapse, because they give you all these pictures of their models. Let me see if I can find the global floor model. Well, that's in here somewhere. But so they modeled several floors of the building, and then they took out columns, and then the idea is, you'd think the idea would be to actually try to simulate what they say happens, which is the entire top of the building starts to move down and starts to crush everything. Well, at least you think they could model that very first part, where the top of the building starts to bend and move down. But they have lots of graphics in their buildings, lots of graphics of the computer model, but they don't have any graphics that show this bending behavior that they say happened. So I think this entire this shenanigan with the cases B and D replacing cases A and C is to hide the fact, to kind of lure you into thinking that, oh, they had to adjust the parameters to get the collapse to happen, when even their computer models, which were extremely tweaked to begin with, and which were even deviated from their experimental data, which was extremely tweaked to begin with, even then they couldn't produce any kind of collapse behavior. Of course, I don't know this because they haven't published their models and they refuse to. And this is with public money. We can't see their computer models, and I think it's very strong evidence that they can't even get their tweaked computer models to generate any kind of collapse scenario. So at the heart of their whole investigation is evasion of the subject they're supposed to be investigating. There's no, so this is the next section, how they evaded what they were supposed to be investigating, which was how the buildings collapsed. They truncated their timeline at the time the building was, quote, poised to collapse, even though their number one objective was to determine why and how the Twin Towers collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft.
Can you rotate your mic back towards you, pointed at you?
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So in their draft report, they say that they admit that their report, quote, does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. Now that's a pretty strong assertion there, that their global collapse, whatever that means, becomes inevitable. It's a bold-faced assertion that has absolutely no basis in evidence, no basis in history, no basis in experiment whatsoever. It's the most antithetical thing to science that you could imagine. And then they tip their hat to it in their actual final report, where they say they provided little analysis, and their little analysis was just this kind of disinformational way of beating up on the conspiracy theorists and making the demolition hypothesis look ludicrous by casting it, by the way that they cast it, and I'll get to that in a minute. So they hide their failure to predict collapse initiation, or even initiation behind this, behind this ruse with the multiple scenarios. They refuse to publish their model. And then in their final report, they finally do start to address the critics, but they do it in this very clever way of wrapping the very serious demolition hypothesis in disinformation. So they talk about, we didn't find any evidence of explosives. Of course, we don't know if they looked. Nor did we find any evidence that missiles were fired at the towers. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, some people talk about that, but it's very effective at wrapping, at just saying, don't look at that demolition idea. It's just part of the same nonsense that these people who are talking about missiles fired at the towers are talking about. So it's a very effective technique of how do you dismiss a serious allegation? You wrap it in nonsense. And also they use a clever mislead to imply that it couldn't have been a demolition because it wasn't from the ground up. Well, a lot of people probably fall for that because most demolitions that we actually see start from the ground up. The building is blown up at the bottom, and the whole building starts to sink, and it harnesses a lot of the kinetic energy of the falling building to do a lot of the destruction. Clearly, that's not how the Twin Towers came down. They were, they exploded from the top down. And clearly, that's not a problem for a controlled demolition because the whole objective of an engineered demolition is you can destroy the building in any way that you want to. I mean, that's what the engineered part of controlled demolition is about. So they very effectively use these disinformational techniques to wall off the idea of demolition and not even treat it seriously. So in summary, their report is not only unscientific, but apparently intentionally deceptive. They conceal their data and methodology. They use disinformation to ridicule the serious demolition hypothesis, and they only respond non-seriously to their critics. And they evaded the very task that they were supposed to be investigating, which is how the buildings came down. Okay, so now this is the final report. This is the final part where I'm going to be talking about evaluating the theories in light of the evidence. So as I referred to earlier, we have the general official story, which is that the general form of the official story, which is that the destruction of these buildings was entirely a result of plane crashes and fires. And then we have these more specific forms of it, which starting with NIST theory, and then there's some in-betweens, these implied theories like the pile driver theory, which are necessary to make NIST theory work. So these can be attacked individually. Now, of course, if one were to disprove NIST theory, it wouldn't disprove the general form of the theory, but it would be strong evidence that there's a problem with the general theory, because if NIST couldn't come up with a convincing theory with $20 million, probably the best theory they could come up with, then that would be a problem. But I'm also going to make some very general arguments about the general notion of the collapse theory. So let's first look at NIST theory. It consists of, according to Kevin Ryan, you can count them in different ways, but seven steps to quote collapse initiation. And of course they avoid describing the actual collapse event. But let's look at those steps leading up to that. So, and each of these steps, at least steps 3 through 7, is like a link in a chain. They're dependent on each other. If any one of these is false, their theory falls apart. It needs each of these steps to happen. So the first step is insulation failures, where supposedly the crash of the airplane stripped off all this insulation and prepared the steel to be attacked by the fires. It's a necessary step. Of course, even then, it doesn't. The numbers don't work. The temperatures don't work. But it's this idea that the plane crash just cleansed insulation off of several stories in the towers, and they use these shotgun tests where they fire a shotgun at a piece of steel in a box, and that's supposed to prove the idea that the plane crash could cleanse all the insulation off of all these different directions of all this different steel work that's all in these parts of the building. What their test does actually show is that it doesn't rattle off. It actually has to be sheared off, and the plane is only coming from one direction. So how did it just manage to shear off all this spray-on insulation? And then there's the second step, which is that once the steel was exposed to fires without the benefit of fireproofing, that it would heat up rapidly, as they say, and then start to soften. Now steel has a very predictable curve in response to elevated temperatures. It loses about half its strength, a little bit around 600 degrees Celsius. These are Celsius degrees. And yet, NIST didn't find any evidence that any of the steel was even elevated to 600 degrees. And in the section that Ryan talks about, the over-design ratio, or rather the the reserve strength ratio of these buildings, of the perimeter walls, for live loads anywhere, we're about 2,000%. So you can increase the live loads by a factor of 20 before you'd start to have a problem. And here, even if all the steel work throughout these floors, which of course it wasn't because we saw that like in the South Tower, the fires didn't even get to the other side of the building, was all exposed to this elevated temperatures. Even if they were exposed to the highest temperatures that they found from any of their evidence, you wouldn't even begin to have a problem because you've only lost 40% of the strength. But moreover, if you actually look at experiments like there's an interesting experiment that's disclosed in the FEMA report, the earlier FEMA report, which talks about tests by the Building Research Establishment in the UK, in which they made test buildings and they exposed them to very high temperature fires for long periods of time, where the steel beams reached 800 to 900 degrees Celsius, which is far hotter than has ever been measured in any actual building or simulation or any other one that I've read about. In the three tests, in all these tests, they were unable to get any of these structures to fail. So even when you get to the point where you're way down on this curve here, and you've lost 90% of the strength, steel still doesn't just fall apart. I mean, if anything, it would start to sag, but it wouldn't just explode into pieces like we saw happen to the towers. Here's where, so they did these, back to these floor tests where they did show some sagging by a few inches. Stephen talked about this, and yet they turned it into 42 inches of sagging in their computer model. And then, so that's the next step. So you got the softening of the steel, and then you have the floors sagging, and then the next step is that the floors are pulling in on these columns, and starting them to bow inward, and then you have the columns becoming unstable, and this instability progressing around the building like in this kind of contagion. And so I don't know which step that is, number 5 or whatever. And then the final step is that you have this downward movement, the beginning of this pile driver scenario where the top of the building starts to move down, and according to NIST, the weakened structure in the impact fire zone was not able to absorb the tremendous energy, that's about as quantitative as it gets, of the falling building section, and, quote, global collapse ensued. They don't explain how this now back to this part, here's the model I was trying to find. They have all kinds of pictures of their computer models, but they don't show any with like a rotating or falling section. Yet they were able to model the plane down to the engine, down to the turbine blade, and they can't even begin to even show this collapse initiation scenario, even with their tweaked computer models. So they don't explain how this downward movement would started. I mean, only about 13% of the columns were taken out, if that, and only random ones were heated. And yet, according to what they're implying here, the whole top went into free fall, like some giant plunger that just starts to travel down in free fall as if the columns just vanished. They provide no calculation of the amount of force that would impact the intact portion, even if that could happen. And of course, they don't model this, and they don't provide any. They don't publish their computer simulations. So as I pointed out, their whole scenario is based on the implicit endorsement of what they call the pile driver, or what you call the smash down theory, where this block of intact building is just smashing itself all the way down, and just smashing the building to oblivion. All this intact structure, 95 floors in the North Tower and 80 floors in the South Tower. And out of their entire 280-page report, there's only 2 paragraphs that even describe, or 2 or 3 paragraphs that even describe the beginning of this scenario, let alone how it could actually progress down the building, remain symmetrical, show all these features of controlled demolition, and so forth. But does the evidence even support the existence of this pile driver theory? Well, here's the North Tower about 8 seconds into the event. And note, you can see the intact portion of the building running all the way up here. And here you see nothing. I mean, no intact columns, not even a sliver. There's parts of the core that are still intact, or little parts, but there's like no part of the exterior wall that you can even see above this. The whole thing is just being obliterated from top down. But my question is, where is the pile driver? Where is this block of intact structure that's supposedly smashing the rest of the building to oblivion? And this is a very abundant body of evidence that shows what these events look like. Now look how, here you can see how the destruction is progressing down the building. Here's building 7 as a point of reference in the foreground. The destruction progresses, 200 feet down the building, and it's exploded out 100 feet wider by that time, maybe about 2 seconds later. Another 3 seconds or so, there's pieces being hurled out 400 feet from the building, 300 or 400 feet from the building. Okay, now, so I just point out there's just no evidence for this pile driver theory. But let's assume that somehow that hidden in this dust cloud, there's like maybe it all got flattened down, but it's still centered. The mass is still centered over there, and it's still smashing the rest of the building all the way down. Somehow it's just very miraculously hidden in that dust cloud. Well, let's talk about how long then if you assume that scenario, is it possible? Does the total collapse time that's documented by the videos, is that consistent with this scenario? Well, what are the total collapse times? There's a lot of confusion about this because, as Stephen pointed out, the Commission report says that the South Tower totally collapsed in 10 seconds. The NIST isn't quite so sloppy. They say that the first rubble reached the ground in the case of the North Tower in about 10 seconds, and I think that's about accurate. But if you look at, I made this composite timeline let's look at a slightly bigger version. By assembling these film strips from videos that I extracted frames from. And I start at the moment, the 0 point in my timeline here is the moment that the mass starts to move down. The mass starts to move down about a half a second before the facade of the North Tower starts to go down. So by 4 seconds, things are getting pretty explosive. By 8 seconds, the building is just mushrooming. By 11 seconds, it's blowing out 300-400 feet in all directions. But there's still a big intact trunk of the building even at that point. And then after about 11 seconds, things start to happen very fast, and the rest of the building just disappears. But you can't really see what's going on behind this huge dust cloud that's just 700 feet wide and still 700 feet tall. So I would say a good a lower bound for total collapse time is around 14 seconds. An upper bound is around 16, maybe even 18 seconds. And it's similar in the South Tower, but the destruction starts a little bit lower, but it's similarly explosive. Establishing the origin of the South Tower timeline is a little more complicated because the top first starts to lean for 2 seconds before it starts its rapid descent into the intact portion. And then you see all these blast waves going down the side of the building. Okay, so given say the figure 14 to 16 seconds, the following model is based on this description of the event. You have the entire top of the building goes into free fall, and the building is described as a series of infinitely thin slabs that are perfectly square slabs, and the whole top starts to move down, and as it encounters the first slab, it picks it up and accelerates it down at the rate necessary for it to catch up with the falling portion so that momentum is preserved, because momentum is always preserved. So it's slowed down a little bit when it picks up that first slab. It picks up another one, it's slowed down a little bit, and it's gaining speed, but there's this inertial resistance happening as it progresses down the building. Now, I did a calculation based on a program, and that gives me total collapse times that are nothing that dramatic. I mean, a total collapse time for the north, again, a brick drop from the north top of the tower in the vacuum would take 9.3 seconds to reach the ground. But in the case of this inertial, this model that takes into account slowdown due to momentum conservation, I get 11.6 seconds in the north tower and 12.6 seconds in the, 11.6 in the south and 12.6 in the north. Time for the roof to reach the ground, the time it takes to crash down is a little bit shorter. But if you look at these events, that model clearly isn't very accurate, because clearly the mass is being dispersed very widely as the building comes down. And I think a reasonable estimate is that at least 80% of the mass of the building fell outside of the building. Almost all the steel of the perimeter walls was outside of the building. Most of the concrete in the building landed far away because it was so finely powderized that it just drifted off. So you don't have chunks of concrete. I do think it's a reasonable estimate that about 80% of the building landed outside the footprint. Now, as soon as it goes outside the footprint, it's definitely not participating in this accelerating of mass down. So you have to factor that out. And so I have this model that disperses a certain proportion of the mass at any given floor outside of the footprint of the building, so it doesn't participate in the smash down of the rest of the building. And again, we're ignoring the actual smashing action. We're just talking about the inertial effect, as if there's no strength at all. Once it encounters that slab, it has no strength. There's no factoring in of the breaking of the columns or anything like that. It immediately picks it up and starts to move down. So when I put in this parameter, not only that, but another parameter that takes into account the fact that the building became much more massive as it reaches the ground. The steel near the top of the building in the columns was only about 1/4 of an inch thick. By the time you got to the bottom, it was more like 4 inches thick. So and the steel was a major component of the mass of the building. So if the bottom story is 1.5 times as massive as the top, and you take into account this mass dispersion, say 6% at each floor, you get into collapse times that are already longer than a reasonable estimate of total collapse times. And that's just taking into account this inertial slowdown. Okay, but of course there's a lot more going on than that. It's not just a matter of this momentum conservation. You also have all these energy flows that are in play as the event is happening. You have all that pulverization action. I mean, people have estimated the amount of energy that would need to go into the pulverization of the concrete would be on the order of the entire energy budget due to the elevated mass of the building. So that blows your whole energy budget right there, just smashing the concrete. And then you have all the columns to break up, and then you have all that mass to fling out for hundreds of feet in all directions. So these energy sinks are in play as the building is going down. But now we're talking, and how does that factor into my earlier point about momentum conservation? Well, it's a little complicated because momentum and kinetic energy are two different things. Momentum is directly proportional to velocity, and it's always preserved, although it can be imparted from one object to another. So you know you have those balls that one hits the other and then the other takes off. Conservation of momentum. Kinetic energy, on the other hand, can be converted from one form to another. So you can have like a kinetic energy of falling mass being converted to heat or pulverization or something else. But if you're looking at it from a kinetic energy point of view, and you're taking into account the flow of energy from potential gravitational energy to kinetic energy of falling to these other energy sinks of pulverization and so forth, that is eating into the kinetic energy and is causing a slowdown. And from a momentum point of view, that means that every time that's happening, every time that something is being pulverized or smashed or the columns are being smashed or whatever, that is transferring momentum of the falling mass to, well, the momentum of actually the Earth. I mean, it moves the Earth ever so slightly, or the two moves together. So that already we used up the entire time of the collapse just taking into account the momentum. Then you get into all these energy considerations, and you don't have anywhere that energy could have come from. So I think that's a pretty sound proof that these buildings couldn't possibly have fallen according to the pile driver theory. So then we're left with a theory like that bizarre shock wave theory, where the building is just miraculously breaking itself up ahead of the falling wave of debris. And then another point about the pile driver theory is that it doesn't explain the peculiar behavior of the South Tower's top. Now let's look at the way that the South Tower came down. Remember I pointed out how it started to tip at first. And I don't know if you can see it on this video, but let's try it. Now watch the angle of the top of the building. It starts tipping. But then as you see the tipping, it actually stopped accelerating. It was tipping, and then it stops. Or the angular momentum comes to the angular rotation actually comes to a halt about right there, as it falls right into the dust cloud. Now everybody's familiar with what leaning objects are like. You know, you chop down a tree, it doesn't start to tip and then start to crush into itself. It tips faster and faster because you have a center of gravity here, and you have a fulcrum here. And as it's tipping, that angle is becoming greater. So it's actually accelerating. You have a moment that's accelerating this intact body. So the only explanation that I think explains this, because remember the fulcrum is over here, or somewhere over here, and the center of gravity is moving further and further here, which should be accelerating. This angular rotation should be getting faster, and instead it's slowing down. So the only explanation is that this whole part of the building is shattered or completely broken up before it even falls into the intact portion of the building. So if the pile driver theory doesn't work in regard to this evidence, it's something else is going on there. Apparently the building is being broken up before the mechanism that the official story describes to that is happening. So this is the final section, and here I go to the most general form. So remember, I'm proceeding from specifics of looking at all those things about the NIST theory that don't work to the more general implied theory of the pile driver or smashdown theory and why that doesn't work. And now, and these arguments maybe are a little more general, and you could call them a proof or maybe not. But it's just to look at, could any theory, any collapse theory, explain the very general global features of these events? And I say no. First of all, the fact that they had all these characteristics of controlled demolition. We'll play an excerpt from David Ray Griffin later that talks about all these. He enumerates like 10 or 11 features that are frequently seen or usually seen in controlled demolitions, very characteristic of controlled demolitions, but have never been observed in any event outside of controlled demolitions. So how likely is it that you could have this cluster of 10 characteristics, say, that are always associated with one kind of event, then all of a sudden you have this supposed collapse event that's never showed those kind of characteristics, and it exhibits all those characteristics. It's a very strong inductive argument that because these events look like a demolition and quack like a demolition, that they were in fact demolitions. Then you have, so this is really kind of a subject of another talk where I go into much more detail about these things. Let's just run through them quickly. You have the rapid onset of destruction. It's not the kind of thing you would expect with any kind of natural event with, with columns being weakened or like that. Rather, they just start this immediate onset, which is very characteristic of demolition. You have these powerful blast waves which blew out the windows in these adjacent buildings 300 or 400 feet away, that hurled objects 400 feet in all directions, that went off with a bang, what the eyewitnesses talk about, these loud explosions at the onset of the events. They have these events that are it's not like a single explosion. I think that's a source of confusion. It's not like the building suddenly exploded. It started to break up and it grew into an explosion, which is the kind of behavior you expect if you had thousands of charges that were going on, contributing and blending into this one giant wave of destruction. You have, the one audio thing I wanted to play was the that's just too complicated to try to get into that. You have the fact that the non-metallic components of these buildings were pulverized so fine that it's very difficult to find any evidence of macroscopic chunks of materials other than metals at ground zero. It's just had all this dust wafting around. There were 4-inch thick floor slabs throughout the towers and 110 floors in each tower, and you can't find an intact, you can look all day, but you can't find an intact chunk of a corrugated floor pan or any coherent assembly in ground zero because all that stuff has been so thoroughly pulverized. The only recognizable parts are these large steel assemblies like the perimeter columns and a few core columns. Oh, and okay, I'm sorry. So I was talking about the fact how that the non-metallic components of these buildings were so thoroughly pulverized that you can look through all these images at ground zero and the only recognizable objects you can find are the large steel assemblies of the core columns and perimeter columns. You can't find the, anything else that's recognizable, and you don't see coherent chunks of other kinds of materials like desks or chairs or toilets or anything like that. And even the humans, I mean, there were 1,100 bodies that were never identified, 1,100 victims that were never identified, despite the fact that the program to identify them via DNA remains identification went on for 2 years. There were cases in which 200 different remains were identified with a single individual. So they were somewhat blasted apart. They just recently found human remains on the top of the Bankers Trust building, that 5 years later. And even the steel was very thoroughly shredded. And then there's the whole issue of residues, which of course Steve went into in great detail. Okay, so that's one argument. That's that it has all these characteristics of a controlled demolition, or actual characteristics that are well beyond a controlled demolition in the degree and the thoroughness of the destruction. So that's, I think, a very powerful argument. But the next one is that if you look at the history of building collapses, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit into anything that you would expect to happen as a result of the alleged cause of this event. Because fires have never destroyed steel frame buildings. I mean, they've gone at fires that were far more intense than the fires that were experienced by the Twin Towers in Building 7 on 9/11, ones that went on for over a day and were burned with big emergent flames. You have to look really hard to find any steel structure that has been totally destroyed or even partially destroyed by fire. Or large steel structure. Here's the McCormick Place incident is referred to. This had a really long span, apparently uninsulated web truss supported roof that fell when there was this huge fire inside, but the walls were still intact. It wasn't a high-rise building, so it's very far afield from the examples we're talking about. And the only examples that we have of natural causes of total destruction of steel frame buildings or even steel reinforced concrete buildings are severe earthquakes, which makes sense because it delivers such an intense shock to the entire frame of the building. And then you don't get the pattern of destruction that looks anything like the smoking ruin of ground zero. Rather, you have buildings that are toppled over on their side or smashed down, but large coherent assemblies of these buildings remain. And if you look at this phenomenon that supposedly explains the total collapse of these buildings, progressive collapse, it's very, almost impossible to find any examples of total progressive collapse of any buildings outside of the alleged cases of the 3 buildings in Manhattan and the Murrah Federal Building, which was a partial collapse, but they used that to explain the extent of the collapse, saying that it was a progressive collapse. In fact, you'll have to look really hard, and the only example I can find of a total progressive collapse of any structure is this L'Ambiance Plaza, which was an accident waiting to happen because basically you had these pillars where they elevated these slabs upon them, and they weren't properly secured. So that was the way they were building this building. They had these vertical columns, and ensleeved within them were these slabs, and they were hoisting them into place. And then they had this. Then they all came pancaking down, a real pancake-type collapse. Of course, this building was not finished. These had not been secured into place yet. The design specifications had been violated, and the rubble pile left recognizable slabs, totally unlike what you see at Ground Zero. Nor did they produce a giant dust cloud when they collapsed. So finally, and I think I skipped ahead and talked about this earlier. This is the point where I talk about can these events be explained by any kind of natural event? That is a spontaneous collapse event as opposed to an engineered event. I just want to talk about 2 points briefly here. One is the symmetry. Natural processes tend to asymmetry. They tend to become more asymmetrical over time. You know, everybody's familiar with when something topples. It doesn't, go straight down into itself. It topples over. And what's even more telling is the case in the South Tower, where remember the top first started to lean, but then instead of becoming more asymmetric over time, it becomes less asymmetric. It actually starts to become the top disappears, and then it just becomes, you can't even tell that it had leaned. It was just so symmetric. It was this ballooning explosion as it consumed the building from top to bottom. This is the fallout pattern, these very radially symmetric patterns. And the consistency of the destruction. Just the fact that these buildings were so thoroughly destroyed, ripped apart, that there was virtually no coherent assemblies remaining. Like this photograph here, this is one of the few pieces I can find of anything that even looks like a piece of a corrugated floor pan. I mean, there were 9,400 double trusses in each of the towers, and those were those very distinctive shapes, those double floor trusses, and yet you can't, you look through all this rubble and you can't find anything except like just random rebar. You can't find those distinctive structures because they were so thoroughly shredded. Now, of course, proponents of the official story will argue for the tremendous energy of the falling mass and everything to account for the level of destruction. But the argument here is that the thorough application of destruction, the fact that it didn't miss anything, that it just thoroughly consumed these buildings, is very indicative of an engineered, not an accidental event. I mean, there were only 300 whole bodies even found because the bodies were just so vaporized, apparently. And then the final point is the point about experimental verification. We're asked to believe that this idea of this total progressive collapse entirely destroyed these buildings for the first time in history, the first example of a complete structure, steel structure, that has ever been destroyed by total progressive collapse. And yet, I challenge anybody to build a model that actually exhibits this behavior, that you can actually build something on any scale that has the same shape as the Twin Towers and disturb it at the top, load it down, make it as heavy as you want, build it out of anything, and get it to collapse neatly down and maintain symmetry and destroy the whole structure. I think it's very challenging to do it. I mean, the architects of that L'Ambiance Plaza did it, but that was a very peculiar design. But I have to maybe modify this challenge a little bit. Nobody's been able to show me any structure that exhibits those characteristics. So that's the scientific method, is, they should theoretically verify. I mean, we're asked to believe that this happened, and yet they can't point to any other examples, and you can't even build something to collapse like this, apparently, or it's very difficult. So anyway, that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
At this time, we were going to take some questions for Jim Hoffman, and we'd also like to welcome back down Dr. Stephen Jones, for those of you that did not get to ask some of those questions, given that the topics of the 2 speakers are overlapping. So if Dr. Jones would like to come down and join us, that would be good. Also, I'd like to point out really quickly before we get to the questions, there are free copies of articles here. So this is Stephen Jones' article. It's right here if you didn't get it. There are also copies of The NIST Debunking and Building a Better Mirage by Jim Hoffman. So please feel free to take these, as well as checking out the DVDs that are out in the lobby here, 9/11 Revisited and 9/11 American Empire. So at this time, are there questions? Yes, we have a question right here. Actually, if maybe we shouldn't have a mad dash if we're going to have questions, but the mad dash has already begun. So let's try to keep the hustle bustle to a minimum, because we'd like to hear questions. Or not. So we have a question here.
Okay.
Yeah, please, we'd like to have questions. So, yes, the picking up of papers is a quiet activity. Here we go.
Jim and Stephen, my uncle flew for United Airlines for over 40 years, and we were talking about actually the possibility of a commercial airline being hijacked and flown into Indian Point nuclear power plant. And what he said was that you cannot find a commercial airliner that will fly over 350 knots, or about 425 miles an hour, even if it was to fly straight down towards the ground at full throttle. And so when they say they're doing 600 miles an hour, there's no way they were doing over 425 miles an hour, which is a difference of 175 miles an hour. And I had that confirmed with 2 other commercial pilots.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. I don't know how they established.
Speak into the mic.
I don't know how they established those crash speeds, but I'm also curious about the idea that a commercial jet couldn't fly faster than 450 miles an hour at ground level. The speed of jetliners is often measured in Mach number. That's the fraction of the speed of sound, because the effects on the airfoil surfaces and so forth build up as a function of the proportion of the Mach number, because you get these phenomenon because it has to do with the speed of sound on the surfaces, and it builds up these shock waves and so forth. The speed of sound is actually faster at sea level than it is, several thousand feet up. And also there's that design claim that I pointed out, where they did talk about a 707 or DC-8 flying at 600 miles an hour on the deck. So I don't know. So that's interesting. I don't know enough about jetliner performance to say one way or the other.
There was another question that was asked. Jim Hoffman, could you please give out your website, because people are very interested in having more access to this information.
Okay, so the best way to find my website is, don't try to remember any URL, just type in 9/11 research to Google, or even just type in 9/11, you'll find it on the first page, 9/11. And so my website is, it's very high ranking on Google, so it's very easy to find. This is what the front page looks like. The URL is actually, it's actually a subdomain, which doesn't make any sense, but it's historically, that's the way it happened. It's actually 911research.wtc7.net. Or just go to wtc7.net and they'll find a link to 9/11 research there. But 9/11 research is by far my most extensive site. I have other sites as well, like 9/11 review and wtc7.net. Those are the main ones.
I wanted to say that the tools that you provided us with today in your speeches, I guess this question is directed at both of you, have obviously tremendous ramifications. And I wanted to ask for any suggestions that you have, because the only way to change things in this country is to get this message to the public one by one by one. And there are a tremendous mass of people that are just going to be so shocked that it's really hard to talk to them about this, because it just discounts, everything that they've believed in. And I wonder if you have any suggestions about how to effectively deal with this, to help people to understand that they've believed a lie for so long, and to get the message out. I mean, if all of us can go out and do that successfully, maybe we can have some impact.
Well, I find that when I interact with people individually, I try to get a sense of what their issues are, what stands in the way of them taking a deeper look at things. And it might just be I mean, it's different for different people. I mean, often I'll kind of strategically start with some issue that maybe they hadn't heard about, Building 7. I mean, Building 7, since people haven't heard about it, they don't have this wall of defensiveness of they've seen the Discovery Channel tell us how the towers came down or whatever, and they're more likely to actually take a look at the evidence that you present them if you kind of present that a little bit out of context. Another thing is, one of the biggest objections that comes up is, oh, how could people possibly have participated in such a vast conspiracy and kept it secret? And I talk a lot with people about that. And one of the, I like to debunk a lot of the notions that people have, like, oh, that it would have taken that long of a time to wire the buildings. Not necessarily. I mean, there's so many different scenarios, ways that could have been done. And I like to, I mean, people just immediately jump to the conclusions, oh, there would have been all this det cord running all through the towers because that's the way they do normal demolition. Well, there's a page on my site. I actually have an FAQ that I talk about all these kind of issues about how demolitions could actually be engineered. And I mean, there's this, you know, I assume it's a wireless operation. You can actually buy the Teleblaster, which will allow you to just distribute these charges and then remotely detonate them in any order. So I address questions like that in detail here. But that's one of the most frequent things that comes up. The associate that has helped me more than anyone with 9/11 research, Greg Roberts, has written an essay which takes on that question specifically. Where are the 9/11 whistleblowers? And he goes into great depth. It's almost a book about this. It just takes on that question because it's so many people. That's the main thing that's in front of them. Oh, how could there have been this vast conspiracy? Well, it wasn't necessarily the vast conspiracy that people think it was, at least not on the operational level of how it was carried out. I mean, clearly there's a lot of people that have cooperated in various ways with propping up the official story. But that's a different issue from how it was actually engineered.
Stephen, yes.
Let me answer, and I want to do two things. I talked to a group of college students about 9/11 because they invited me to answer questions. With them, we started with, in fact, right away it came, how can you have so many people involved in this and keep it secret? That seems to be almost a knee-jerk question that you get. So I talked to them about some historical events. The Reichstag fire, for example, was at 1933, I think, where now we know, but we didn't know then, Hitler's people, Nazis, you know, set a fire in the Reichstag, which was the German parliament building at the time, and killed Germans. I mean, these German officials were killed. And there was actually one fellow that told a magazine that, you know, in other words, he blew the whistle. He was discounted and he was found dead fairly soon. I don't remember his name, but I could find. Anyway, so there's an example. But it did come out in the Nuremberg trials, and finally is accepted now that that was the Nazis who caused the fire and killed Germans, and they blamed it, by the way, on the Communist Party, so that the Nazi Party could have ascendancy over a Communist Party at the time. Then you have, you know, the Gulf of Tonkin, which I think, did that come up this morning? Anyway, Daniel Ellsberg blew the whistle on that and revealed what happened. But after the war was over. Now let's see, the Reichstag fire, that took 33 to, so it took about a dozen years. Even though there's one whistleblower, he was discounted, discredited, and killed. And then that was kept secret for a long time. How about the Holocaust? You know, that was kept secret. That was a very big, tremendously awful. It was so awful, I think people could hardly believe it. Same sort of situation. It took a long time before that was established. Again, the Nuremberg trials established that without a doubt, in my view. But anyway, so, and there's other examples. The Maine, remember the Maine? To hell with Spain. I told the students about that one. You can Google on that one if you. That's the Spanish-American War, 1898. We blamed the sinking of the Maine on Spain so that we could attack Spain and the Caribbean and knock them out of there. It turns out later, as you pull up the Maine, it wasn't knocked out by a mine of any type, not a Spanish mine or anything. It was some kind of explosion, but it was blamed on the Spanish. And so after you get these historical examples of events that were either staged, another good example is the Himmler operation. You can Google on that one. Again, this was Himmler the SS leader. German prisoners dressed up as Polish soldiers shot, and this is along the Polish-German border. So then the press, and this was blamed as the Polish attacking Germany. You know, here you've got these Polish soldiers, and the press, of course, reported this here. And that came out again after the war. And this was really the basis for attacking Poland by Germany. So you have all these staged events. I mean, I could go way back to Nero, Lusitania. I mean, so there's lots of these. And so after a while you say, well, wait a minute. If there's an event, maybe the first thing we should think of is, was this a staged event as a pretext for war? I mean, what war followed? If there's a war that follows, we have to think, well, maybe this was, allowed or staged. Even allowed, in other words, was there foreknowledge? That's another. So that's one way to approach it. The other way, I'd like to. Pearl Harbor's another one. Yeah. Okay, Mexico, which war has not been started, by some event to make it look like you're defending the homeland. You see. Okay, so after a while you say, yeah, that's the norm. Okay. Historically, it takes, and the students catch on to that real quick. I noticed, and it's not. Well, there does seem to be this myth that America can't do such things. You see, but on the other hand, we're human too, and and so you have all these historical events. Okay, the other thing I'd like to say is. I was influenced by WTC7.net. That's where I got after several nudges. So my first introduction where I really got into this was through Jim's site. I thank you for that, Jim. It's had a lot of influence. And in my paper, I point to Jim's site several times so as to encourage. Now, I'd like to know, though, other people get involved through some DVD, or a paper. I've had people tell me that my paper influenced them to get started studying this. It's a learning curve for all of us, right? We're still on this learning curve. And by the way, there's a lot on this learning curve as you peel back the onion layers. There's a lot more than just the collapse of the buildings, right? The lack of air defenses. I mean, the put options. I Google on that. All these things. So PNAC. Oh my goodness. So yeah. But I would like to know how many of you got your start, if you can think back on this learning curve for 9/11. Let's just see through. Through the internet. Let's just do it the internet generally. Your start. Somehow that's really where you got your start. Okay, what was that? Guns and Butter. Is that what it? That's radio. Radio. Okay, radio.
It's Bonnie Faulkner's show.
What DVDs? Let's see who got their start through someone giving them a DVD. Internet DVD too. Building number 7. How many was it? Building 7. What?
All right, one at a time here.
What is?
All right, wait a minute. One at a time here, please. One person talks at a time.
Oh, yeah. You mean early on like 9/11? Oh, yeah. How many thought that was strange right at the beginning? Wow, that's quite a few. That's quite a few. Okay, yeah. I wasn't as suspicious, but as soon as I saw Building 7 come down, then I was suspicious. Fox, I understand, will not show the collapse of Building 7.
Okay, so right.
Michael Berger told me that. They invited him to interview. He said, okay, I'll do it on one condition. You show the actual collapse of Building 7, not some photos, the actual collapse. They refused to do it. And that happened with me on the Tucker Carlson show, too.
Yeah. Let's get a couple more questions before we break for dinner. People that haven't asked questions before.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for presenting this. I mean, this has been very illuminating, but also I want to apologize because I missed a good part of this. I came in a bit late, and there are three things that are bothering me, and I don't know if you've already addressed these or not. But one is, how did they know that the airplanes were going to be hijacked and that they were going to hit the tower? Number two, how is it that they coordinated the demolition of the tower with the hitting of the airplanes? And number three, why?
Okay, next question.
That's a good question. Don't you think that's a good question? Oh, yeah. I do too. All right.
So let's see. How did they know the planes were going to be hijacked? Well, if you accept the demolition hypothesis, it really does throw the whole official story about that the hijacking of the planes was strictly the work of Islamic terrorists totally into question. Because I mean, if you had that much riding on an operation, if everything had to go right, would you trust it to some people, crazy people to do it? I don't think so. So I assume therefore, I don't have any evidence of this. But that it was that the piloting of the planes was done electronically, and that there was control was seized somehow. The crew and passengers were disabled, and they were piloted to their targets electronically. Secondly, how could the buildings have been? How could this have been pulled off? The buildings pulled off, and it's synchronized with, or synchronized so that it would happen after the planes crashed, and without setting off, without the plane crashes ruining that preparation. That's a really interesting question, and I go into it in a lot of detail on this frequently asked questions about demolition right here. There's actually a whole series of answers to that, and I think it's a little bit too detailed to get into right now. And then the third question, why, is to create a pretext. I mean, people have said, oh, they didn't need to. They could have just crashed the planes into the building. They didn't need to bring the buildings down. But I really believe that it was the incredible shock and awe of those buildings just disappearing, or just blowing up, that that really went all the way. That really gave them what they that really assured that they would have shocked the people into being able to get away with what all the things that they've done in the name of 9/11.
And they actually announced it publicly through the Rebuilding America's Defenses document published in 2000 by the Project for the New American Century, when they talked about the need for a new Pearl Harbor.
This is directed at Dr. Jones. What were your thoughts of what happened on 9/11 before you began seriously investigating it? And as a side note, I was remembering your participation in the LA 9/11 Symposium, which was on C-SPAN, and I was wanting to gain your impression of Alex Jones.
All right, let me do the second one first. So, the first time I met Alex was in Chicago, actually, at that meeting early June of this year. And Alex gets up there, if you've ever heard him on the radio, he's even more in person. And I'm sitting down there, with my nice quiet slides, and, and so it was quite my impression of him was he's a go-getter. And I think it takes all types. Ken Jenkins says, the people have different personality types. I'm more of a peacemaker. Alex is more of, I forget the term, revolutionary or something. So, we all have different talents, and it works to have different people approaching it. I think he's a great guy. I'm just glad to be one of the Jones boys, And let's see, the other one was, what did I think before? Yes, because I was, a good Republican, and I didn't vote for Bush the second time around. I always sniff things, but that was before I got into this, I mean, things are going haywire. A lot of people recognize that, even if they don't know about 9/11, And my dad told me he just could not vote for the Republicans this last election, and he's been Republican for as long as I can remember. But so I was introduced. I had friends that nudged me, and one friend gave me In Plain Sight, which to me was, it talks about pods and missiles and stuff. It turned me off it was not a good one for me. And so there is this element that we have to, apply the scientific method. I think this is one of the reasons for this conference, is say, look, we're sorting out wheat from chaff, which happens in other other fields of research endeavor. You understand? You've got to sort out to get things to be accepted, and we have to sort out what's not true from what is true. Anyway, that video turned me off. But getting just people nudging me and getting to Jim's site where I could check references for myself. Jim does careful research and has references, and so I went to those references. I remember particularly the sulfidation, which still means a lot to me. I went to the original, which he referenced, and read that, and I was on my way, climbing the learning curve.
I just wanted to put in a quick follow-up plug for Alex Jones. I've never recommended him before because his style just doesn't work for me, so I assume it won't work for other people. But I do want to put in a brief plug for TerrorStorm. I think it's got some fantastic detail and background on the attack on the USS Liberty and some of the examples that you talked about. And he keeps his voice a lot more calm in that video.
We have time for 2 more questions, and we have to convene for the evening session. Are there any younger people or women that would like to ask questions instead of all these white guys? I'm not saying anything wrong here. I'm just looking. You asked a question earlier. I'm trying to mix it around. Okay, up front there, and then right here.
Where does NIST get their photographs from? Are they their own photographs, or are they from bystanders on the day during the collapse? I'm talking about specifically of the collapse pictures, not the aftermath.
Talk about what they did with Oklahoma City, too. Same guys, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things that the segment I wanted to play by Kevin Ryan, where he talks about the fact that some of the same people that were involved in the Oklahoma City investigation and did that engineering report on that building were the people who were involved in the World Trade Center, which is an entirely different kind of building, entirely different cause, the alleged event. Oh, and what was the question?
Photos.
Oh, so NIST boasts about, I don't know how many photos, thousands of photos, and 7,000, and that various people sent them in. I think they had a call out, and lots of people sent them in their amateur photographs, apparently. I imagine that they scoured, the news media for photos and videos. So I really don't know. I think they talk a little bit about that, like where all these people sent them photos. But of course, that's a whole body of evidence that might have a lot of overlap with the body like that I've collected for 9/11 research, but I don't know. They probably have a lot more, and that's why that'd be a very valuable body of evidence to get a hold of.
We only have time for 1 more question, unfortunately, because we're running over, and this gentleman here is going to ask. However, I'm actually quite delighted that we've been running over and there's been so much interest and questioning. So I would please definitely like to invite everybody to the evening session, which will be starting around 6:45 instead of 6:30, because we're running a little behind. And I do promise 2 things. 1, there are still all these free articles up here to get, and there's more material out in the hall. And the other, you can feel free to talk to these gentlemen once we're finished. But unfortunately, I have to wrap some things up because we have to get ready for the last session. So 1 more question.
Hi. Okay. Hi, Sean. I have 2 comments and invite your comments as you will. One is on the electronic control of the planes. That's standard equipment on the planes used. I've looked that up on the Boeing website. And if you guys know of anybody done research in that regard. Secondary, separating the wheat from chaff. I've noticed a lot of good scientists, won't name any names, but they've put forth a lot of research, and then all of a sudden there was a change, and now they're putting very bad science forward and mixed in with what everybody's trying to do. And if you could share any stories or comments there.
Should I not? I'll mention the latter because, there's a group of researchers, use a nice polite term, that believe that, promote this idea that no planes hit the towers. Now, the Pentagon is another issue. We're lacking data, but on the towers, there's a lot of data. that shows that real planes hit these buildings, including debris and the swaying that you see. And it's been mapped out, the ringing and the damping of the oscillations of the tower after it was hit by a plane. It implies something very massive and moving fast hit the plane, for example. Now, these fellows, though, people, not just men, but people that promote the no planes theory also have the characteristic that they will vehemently and personally attack those who challenge the no planes theory. I've run into that, and early on, actually, and I can name them. I think you may know the names. Unfortunately, professor who lost her job has joined this group and gone in with those methods, and it's just regrettable. I think really we need more unity and to agree on the important areas where the evidences are very strong. I went through 4 areas. You know, it took me an hour and a half, but I think those areas are very strong, and there's several others areas that are very strong. Publishable, solid, lots of evidence, scientific method applies. So for us then, we need to, as we sort out the wheat from the chaff, we don't need to use personal attacks. That's why I'm hesitant even to name these people. But rather, we need to seek for unity on that which we can agree on. It's just, well, I'd rather see unity than infighting. We'll get a lot further ahead if we stick with the solid.
That's a fine note to end this session on. Thanks very much to Jim Hoffman and Dr. Stephen Jones. They will both be speaking at the evening session. So there's about an hour or so break for dinner. We're going to be showing a brief